Welcome to another edition of the SumerSports Show. Lindsay Rhodes and Thomas Dimitrov with you. Now that week 3 is in the books, we have a wild, I guess, standings to discuss here, Thomas, through 3 weeks. Like, I think the overarching theme of today's episode is going to be who is good. Because, I mean, what a crazy week with the teams who had not won winning this week. And now it just feels like there are tons of teams that are either 2-1 or 1-2. Very few winless teams. We've got 3 left in the AFC, none in the NFC. That's the Titans, Bengals, and Jaguars. And the Bengals, we're circling on that list there. We've got 3 undefeated teams in the AFC. Buffalo and Kansas City, not surprising anybody, but Pittsburgh is in that mix. 2 undefeated teams in the NFC. It's the Vikings and Seahawks. I don't know who predicted that going into the season. So we've got a lot to discuss here based on the 3-week sample size that we've seen so far.
The unbeaten and the beaten teams, or the winless teams. I mean, who would have thought, right? I'm looking at that. I'm thinking there's some good teams who are winless, of course, and there are some teams that I loved Mike Florio's comments about the Chiefs. They play in their food. That line is such a great line because I'm watching them against Atlanta and I'm thinking, quit kind of messing around. Like, just do your thing to do what you need to do to play. And I just thought that was a funny line. I was listening to Sims today in Unchained, and he was talking about that line. And I thought, hey, that's a very talented football team, but I feel like they're kind of bored sometimes.
Yes.
And they just we all talk about that. And then they just turn it on when they need to. So I feel like there's a lot of that up and down inconsistency, but when it's time to go, these teams are pulling things off and, coming through with some big wins. Of course, they're not perfect. The Colts, and not that they're undefeated or defeated, get their win the way it was. We'll get into that, right? Blown away by how that game looked up to that point of win.
I mean, in so many ways, the Colts are a team that I definitely want to hit with you. The Chiefs, I think, are an interesting place to start because I think if there is one team on the entire in the NFL out of all 32 that you can circle right now and say, like, this team's 100% going to be in it at the end, I feel very, very confident about that. I mean, honestly, you look at the standings and you're like, I don't feel that confident about a whole lot of things, but the Kansas City Chiefs, I am confident are going to be in the postseason at the very least. I think that they're so fascinating that they have actually looked as bad as they have looked. And you and I were texting back and forth during that game, and like, Patrick Mahomes didn't look good and Travis Kelce didn't look good. And I have been a big, my fantasy co-host is like, Patrick Mahomes is not elite anymore in fantasy. And I'm like, in fantasy, please say the in fantasy every single time because he's clearly elite and he's so good. But he did not look good in this particular game. And yet they're undefeated. Like, we've seen what we've seen out of that team. And yet here they sit at 3-0. Looking like the worst possible version of themselves. And I just think it's fascinating that they can do that.
It's fascinating. And remember, Atlanta has a hell of a defense brewing there right now. I mean, those 2 safeties right now, Bates and Simmons, and what they're doing, they just rock it back there. I love watching them play. I'm a huge defensive back, like safety aficionado. Like, I love that play. I think it's such an important part to a defense. Their linebackers are coming. They're not still getting the rush they need, of course. And I don't think that they're necessarily built to have like massive pass rush there, of course. But this is a defense run ultimately. I mean, I know Lake is getting he's calling the game. I get it. But Raheem Morris is bringing a defense there that we know he can do, right? Just the mentality. They're tackling well. They're moving around the field. We're supposed to be talking about the Chiefs. I just wanted to say, like, it's not a pushover in any way. And you're right. He played subpar. I'm talking about Mahomes. I have to tell you this. It almost felt like, why in the hell aren't they getting the ball to Kelce, who we know is so good? And it came to me, and I'm sorry to do this. It was a Tay-Tay moment. And I'm like, she's not in the stands. She's not in, like, does he feel a little down and a little melancholy because his gal wasn't there? I'm being facetious, of course, but he didn't feel like he was there energy wise either. I don't know. Maybe can you help me with that? You might know. You
be careful. You be careful with where you're going with this, Thomas. I know you are now on social media again on Instagram. Everybody go follow him at Thomas Dimitrov. The Swifties will come after you.
Okay. So, well, look, I mean, maybe they can help me with it and educate me on it, because I get the Swifties. I understand the Swifties. I just want for that team to excel. I mean, look, you look at where they go and the play by their receiver the other night. I mean, I'm sitting there watching him and I'm thinking, man, this cat is on fire. Let's
Hershey
continue to get
Rice.
the ball. Yeah, Rice. Let's continue to get the ball though to Kelsey. Let's move it around like we can so it opens things up. And they're playing with a running back that I'm watching for a while. And at first, I think I was texting you saying, I don't know. I mean, they're playing with pedestrian here, and yet he was rolling and he was doing his part, right? He
Yeah.
was so in the end, that offense, for some reason, they were up and down. They pulled it off in the very end, of course, because we won't even talk about the call on, giving it to Bijan Robinson for 4 seconds before he got to the line. That's a
Oh,
whole other situation. But
I thought when you said the call, I thought you were gonna say, the, call in the end zone that was not called by the referees. So much conversation about whether or not they get the benefit of the doubt where the referees are concerned.
well,
Um,
you think about that though. I'm sitting there listening, I'm watching, and as a defensive player you get a guy like, Chris Collinsworth was calling it, it was a penalty all day long. So was, of course, the entire fan base there. But then after the game, a defensive coach by trade, Tony Dungy, called Chris Collinsworth out. He said, that's a bang, bang play through and through, no question about it. And then, who knows? But look, in the end, 3 more penalties went Atlanta's way, down the stretch there when they were moving it. And it just came down to that final play, of course, and it didn't get done. Who, by, again, what I'll say, one of the best running backs in this league in Bijan Robinson. It just forever is something, and this is not specific to the Atlanta Falcons. It frustrates the hell out of me when a play is called and it takes, I mean, I'm counting it now. Maybe I stretched it, but I'm going 1, 2,
yeah.
3, 4 before he could even get upfield. That's a lot of coming by the defense, right? Instead of a quicker hit, because I think it was even a half a yard, right? So that's a
Yeah.
complicated one for me to get my head around.
I mean, it's no Chicago Bears 4th and a foot and end up losing like 13 yards. I don't know. I know you're not on Twitter, so you might not have had that video sent to you over and over again about what a disaster that one specific play was for the Chicago Bears offensive line. They look like it's like a frameable picture, Thomas, like where they're all on the ground in these weird positions. Like, how did you end up laying down during the play? I don't understand. They all whiffed. But that's a separate conversation about the Bears, who I think at this point in time, we're not like rushing to judgment about the Bears, but there's no use in discussing them when we're talking about who's good in the NFL. I think that this is probably not going to be their season to go anywhere, though I assume that they'll probably get better as the season goes on. What about the Steelers? The Steelers sitting there at 3-0 with Justin Fields having stepped in at quarterback after having been unceremoniously let go by the Chicago Bears in order to go get another quarterback who's now struggling there. I mean, at the very least, I think it's probably fun for a lot of people to watch him have success and just say like, hey, look, this is good to see a guy who just got thrown away, kind of like Sam Darnold, like, showing that he can actually lead a team. I don't know how much of their success is because he is the quarterback, though. Their defense is number 1 in EPA per play. What do you make of what you've seen so far from Pittsburgh?
I mean, watching them the first game, of course, against the Falcons and what they were doing there and really focusing on that game. Yeah, I mean, that defense is stellar. They are Mike Tomlin through and through. That football team, I just, for some reason, when I see Tomlin right now, he's buffed up in the way he is, just his physical presence right now. I think he's changed his do, or maybe he's not wearing his hats, and it just, he's got this presence about him. I feel like the D plays that way. I mean, every time I watch Watt come off the edge, I'm like, this cat will turn things upside down. And it's just fun to watch that amongst many other people on that defense, Lindsay. I mean, and then I flip over to the offense and I look at a quarterback who's, I think there are a lot of critics out there, of course, but I think he's playing sound right on. What are his interceptions? I'm going to put Stopsky on the mark
Stopsky
here.
called out. Justin Fields has thrown 1 interception.
Just one, right? I mean, I think
only 2 touchdowns.
Yeah. Well,
but only 1.
I think what they're doing with him and his decision making, I think it's just been sound. Run him when he can run, keep the game alive the way they are doing. And I mean, I'm impressed with the consistency there, as what I'm saying, I think, on both sides, and with a hell of a defense, of course.
His total EPA is 12th in the NFL at quarterback.
Okay. Well, I guess, you're coming in and I'm thinking from the very get-go they were going to be playing Russell Wilson, so my head wasn't around this. And now I'm watching him, I think, with each game, and he's got a good support there, I feel, right? I feel like at Chicago it was always like one thing after another. It just felt that way for some reason. I feel like whenever you're
Uh-huh.
involved with the Pittsburgh Steelers, a very, very sound organization, I just feel like they know how to take care of it. They know how to take care of the ups and the downs, which is something, of course, to the Rooney family is a massive credit. And Omar Khan's doing his work right now. He's not a big time name in GM world, right? But took over a couple years ago, right? This is his third year, I believe, already. And building a football team there that's consistent and tough, as we know. So I like it.
Notable for Justin also, so his pressure rate is 35%. That's not low. It's not the highest either, but his sack rate is just 19%. So
Uh,
that's good. That's an important stat for quarterbacks, right? Because you're going to be under pressure. You got to have somebody who can at least evade that and keep the play alive, and it looks like he's doing that fairly well. I mentioned his EPA. His completion percentage over expectation is positive.
of
Small, small,
course.
small steps here, but
Yep.
actually, it's pretty high. It's the fourth highest through 3 weeks.
And his
That's
sack, what 19 you said, but where did that put him ranking wise? Does
I
it?
don't have the percentage. I had
Okay.
to do the math myself. He has 32 quarterback pressures and 6 sacks.
Okay, I got it.
So,
Well,
it's
look,
gonna be pretty good.
yeah, in the end, it's good to see them playing the way they are. I think people weren't sure how to expect everything with that precarious quarterback situation. To their credit, they brought in two guys at a very low rate as far as financials, right?
Yep. Mhm.
I just think that's a sound move, and it'll be fun to watch how they play throughout the year. Again, with the head coach who he is, he's going to have them ready. It's a good football team.
The Vikings are a good football team too, and I think that they're slowly becoming one of my favorite football teams to root for this year for a bunch of different reasons. But my investment emotionally is not what we're talking about here. Let's get into some tangible reasons that they are good. Obviously, we've talked about Sam Darnold producing, and props to him. We've talked about that quite a bit, but he is notably fifth in completion percentage over expectation. He's crushing it. We know that. Let's talk about the defense, because especially coming off that game against Houston and an offense that we all know is very, very good, just stacked. Now, they didn't have Joe Mixon or Damian Pierce, and they had to slide in Cam Akers, and he's not my
Mhm.
favorite running back. That's a separate story. I think we still expected Houston to have some degree of success, but Brian Flores is crushing it. This defense is fourth in EPA per play after being 20th last year. EPA per rush, they're third after being 13th last year. In EPA per pass, they're seventh after being 22nd. Their sack rate is fifth after being 21st last year. Pressure rate, eighth after being 17th.
Wow.
Their get off time is seventh fastest after being 28th. Their yards before contact per attempt allowed is first in the NFL, 0.22. That's crazy. And they were fifth in that department last year. I guess my point is that the defense is playing really well. And from a roster building standpoint, which is kind of our jam here at SumerSports, it's notable to point that out, the fact that they were able to bring in a lot of defensive pieces in free agency this offseason that they otherwise might not have been able to pay for had they paid Kirk Cousins. So this is part of the trickle down that we sometimes don't talk about. You talk about Kirk Cousins and Sam Darnold like it's a 1-for-1 swap. Well, it's not exactly a 1-for-1 swap, because Kirk Cousins is a lot more expensive, and he would have been a lot more expensive for Minnesota. The fact that they didn't re-sign him and they took a discount on Sam Darnold's making $10
Hmm.
million a year, I believe, off the top of my head, frees up a ton of money for them to go add some pieces like an Andrew Van Ginkel and some of these other guys that are playing defense and playing so well, which is why I mentioned their ranks last year compared to this year. This is a big part of the storyline with regards to why Minnesota is playing so much better.
So I agree with you. By the way, look at you just rhyming off some legitimate analytics. Like, I mean, you so belong at SumerSports. I love it. I think it's great. And you have me on the edge of my seat here. I'm literally not even sitting down. So just so everyone knows that. However, I will say, let's talk B-Flow, Brian Flores, for a half a minute, at least
Yes.
when you talk about his approach to playing football and defense and his sort of tough ass, edgy side, which I don't care who you are, that's what you want in a D coordinator. Where he's going to go eventually, and we could get off this topic. And is he going to land again as a head coach somewhere? Is he a guy that has that skill? No question, he does, and he knows that there are certain things he's going to have to adjust and change. Right, a little aside on that, meaning his approach might have to change a little bit. His interaction with management, his interaction with the other coaches,
Quarterback.
yeah, and quarterback. Let's call it the way it is, right?
Mhm.
But he is an authentic, tough through and through guy. We know each other from our Patriot days, and I have a lot of respect for him. So, but back to his defense, what he's doing, how you watch them fly around, right? You watch them get up the field, they pressure like they should have. I bet you he's been salivating thinking about playing against this quarterback in Stroud, still a young guy, right? Everyone's lauding Houston, yourself included. I like Houston, don't get me wrong. But sometimes I'm thinking, okay, we're gonna build this team up. All of a sudden, you're gonna get an edgy D coordinator like Brian Flores who's saying, "I'll be damned if this cat and this team is gonna run roughshod over me." Oh, by the way, do you think there's any extra little angst about it? Did he possibly not get a job with the Houston Texans? He has legitimate connections with Nick Caserio. What happened there? So does that provide the impetus to come in here and run roughhouse over this offense that's supposedly and ranked very high, right?
That's a really good point. And I had not really put two and two together, but people talk about revenge games a lot in the NFL, like playing against your former team. And by the way, in Minnesota's locker room after the game, Kevin O'Connell gave out game balls to 3 people who had been on the Texans roster and staff. So clearly that matters, right? We all know that players want to beat the team that let them go or whatever, but I wouldn't have even necessarily connected those dots. And that actually is probably even more of a motivating revenge type situation. Like, you thought that you couldn't hire me because of whatever was happening in the press or whatever, and you didn't give me a shot. Well, I'm going to make you pay for that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's human nature, right? So I'm not trying to stir that pot. It's a pot that is no question out there on a lot of levels. To your point, revenge games, agitation, I'll show you games. I mean, we all know those. I mean, let's not try to act like it isn't there. When Brian Flores is going into that game, whoever he's going against, if there's background in some of this that had happened with owners or presidents or GMs or whoever didn't hire him, he is going to go out there flexing his muscles and said, all right, you're getting the very best D coordinator out there. And in his mind, probably the very best head coach that you could have had, but that you didn't have. So in the end, watching the way that he plays that defense, and they play the defense for him, with an overall team that has this swagger right now. I love watching them. You sit there and you watch some of these quarterbacks out there, and we're gonna get to the Carolina Panthers game too. Guys that you're thinking, really, are these guys really going to help these guys win? And it's been fun to watching both of them. I'm talking about Sam Darnold and of course, Andy Dalton. Those guys are throwing strikes, man. There were darts all over the field. We'll get to the other game, I know now, but it's just fun to watch.
Houston, just want to follow up real quickly because I am a big fan of Houston's roster. Now they are pretty low in terms of O-line rankings when it comes to run blocking. We've got them here at Sumer 24th in run blocking. I don't know the answer to this, and this is worth a follow-up question. How far they fell down maybe this week, because I think sometimes running back play impacts that score, I would imagine. And I am not a fan of Cam Akers. Cam Akers has been inefficient consistently every stop that he's been. So I was not optimistic that Houston was just going to go into Minnesota, plug him in, give him as much volume as like a Joe Mixon and just be totally fine. Like, that's a downgrade there. But is that an area that you think is worth circling and keeping our eye on there that could be problematic? As I'm saying this though, Joe Mixon's been crushing.
Yeah.
So I kind of think that probably was largely.
I mean, this is not
Those.
rocket science, but we know, I mean, we so know how you have to have an operational run game in today's world. We've talked about it. We'll come back, continue to talk about it. 38 yards rushing in that game, right? The reality is, I mean, 4 of 14 on third down conversions. I mean, these are all
Yep.
things that lead back into a guy who is calling a hell of a game in B flow. 4 sacks, 2 interceptions. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't hurt that the Vikings, I mean, it does hurt. It doesn't help that stat that the Vikings were up pretty big, right? Like a 34-7. And I know it wasn't 34-7 for the whole game, but the Texans were in a negative game script from a rushing standpoint, which I think is why we saw them throw the ball so much. I mean, we
Mm.
even saw Davis Mills out there for 12 pass attempts. Like they were like, we're done. Let's just go ahead and protect CJ Stroud. So that doesn't lead to a strong rushing
Mhm.
day either. But yeah, Cam Akers, 9 attempts, 21 yards for a
21 yards.
2.3 yard per play average is not what you're looking for. Another team that I
So,
think was interesting from an offensive line standpoint that I thought had legs and was surprised about how bad they looked offensively speaking was the Saints. The Saints through 2 weeks we talked about a lot, and then they just could not get anything going against Philadelphia. Now, I'd be interested to hear from you how much credit you think goes to Philadelphia's defense because their defense hadn't been particularly good through 2 weeks, and maybe they just got a lot better and it started clicking for Philadelphia, and that's where credit goes. But New Orleans definitely had some issues on the line. The Eric McCoy left with an injury, and it felt like that was potentially damaging for their offense. According to Sumer's raw metrics, they were roughly 13% worse without him on passing downs. But the big story this past week was their run blocking. In the first 2 weeks, New Orleans was first overall, according to Sumer's Football AI, in run blocking efficiency. That dropped to 18th in week 3, where they saw their rushing production also drop from an average of 185 yards the first 2 weeks to 89 in week 3. You may recall, if you look at like the box score there, that you've got um, Alvin Kamara. It didn't look like a particularly bad game, right? He had 26 rush attempts for 87 yards. So you're still getting 87 yards, but in terms of efficiency, his number came way down. That's 3.3 yards per pop. And the thing that really struck me, and I actually heard this watching on Red Zone, dropping into that game every once in a while. Greg Olson was talking about how important the explosive plays were. And we did not see that from them on this particular day. The explosive plays obviously went way down. And so that probably had something to do with the O line, maybe, and the yards before contact, perhaps.
yeah, I'm kind of like I'm torn here because I'm a big Alvin Kamara fan. Maybe he didn't have the defined explosives, but what? He's still at 120 plus yards. He had 40 yards receiving, I think, as well. He had legitimate plays. 87 yards is not it's not a bad day, right? He came to the table. They were playing well, I thought. I think the McCoy thing, his replacement, it wasn't like he was getting run roughshod right over. There were all kinds of stunts going on in there. And my point is, I mean, I was so frustrated with the Philadelphia Eagles early on even the first 2 games with Vic Fangio's, defense. I know that he gives up a lot, but he doesn't break in the end. That's what he's known for, right? It seems that way anyway. But it was good to see Vic and his group play, a more aggressive defense. I'm not saying they weren't playing aggressive, but they were getting some of what needed to get done. And I think that showed in that game for sure.
Yeah, holding New Orleans to 219 total net yards after the way that they'd started the season.
Yeah.
You got to be happy about that if you're the Philadelphia Eagles. Are you okay with what you're seeing there offensively out of them?
Yeah, I am. I think, yeah, I am. I mean, obviously we talked about the running back. I mean, and Saquon Barkley, what he can do for them and keep the pass game going. I feel like, and I know it's part of Hurts's game. Sometimes I just want him to make, 20 passes in a row so that Howie can sit down on his seat and settle down and not lose his mind every time his quarterback runs thinking he's going to blow a knee or something like that. And I get it's what he is. It's a combination, and it's pretty damn cool when it happens. But I would be interested to know what the passing dispersion was
Well,
amongst his receivers.
so in this game against New Orleans, we targeted Dallas Goddard 11 times.
Right.
for 10 catches, 170 yards. Whew, some big plays there. He had a 61-yarder. Devontae Smith, who obviously left with the concussion. And so now we have to keep an eye on Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. This was notably a game where they didn't have A.J. Brown. So for a chunk of the game, they didn't have A.J. Brown or Devontae Smith. And then Paris Campbell and Kenneth Gainwell, and but it was pretty heavily. They went to Dallas Goedert and Devontae Smith a lot in this game.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to watch the Goddard deal because I think as we've talked, he's such an important part to an offense. I would use him as much as I could. I'm as keep saying this, huge fan of that high percentage shot, and Goddard just tore it up. I thought it was a really important part of what they were doing, obviously, in the game on offense.
They put up a lot of yards. So 460 yards. I mean, you could look at a bunch of different metrics that said that they had a really good game. They just didn't actually score that many points, right? This was a very low scoring game considering what people were expecting here. This had the highest point total of the week, or one of them. And we only ended up seeing 27 total points. So an interesting game flow there. You talked about wanting to see somebody make like 20, complete 20 passes in a row. Well, how about Jaden Daniels on Monday Night Football? That guy only had 2 incompletions all night. We're talking about like a 91% completion percentage. Just bonkers. I mean, stats that you never see. I mean, the game in and of itself was something you never see. No punts or turnovers in the game for either team for the first time in an NFL game since 1940. So what do we make of what we saw there, considering the fact that clearly both teams had massive defensive problems? So how do we judge the offense there? What's your takeaway?
Well, we're judging an offense that, Dan Quinn's coming in, you want to start talking about Cliff Kingsbury, because I know you have some strong thoughts on that. We don't have to throw darts, but the reality is you have a strong opinion. I would love for you to lead in on that.
Well, I do. So here's the thing about Cliff Kingsbury that's always kind of confused me, because it's been a consistent pattern that he's developed that I know has frustrated a lot of people because it just feels so limiting. But I would love to get your opinion about this. He consistently lines up his wide receivers, DeAndre Hopkins in Arizona. He's started the season this way with Terry McLaurin. It's like a number one wideout, you're on the left wide receiver constantly. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins, I posted on Twitter a few weeks ago, his left wide receiver percentage rates every year of his career. And you can literally tell without actually knowing when he was in Arizona, because it's like, it goes from like 50% to like 88 and then 82. And then it's just, he locks that guy down on one side. Now, just from a very basic zoom out standpoint, I look at that and I say, that feels problematic to me, because if I have a really good cornerback, I know exactly where their best wide receiver is going to be. He's always going to be there. They're not moving him around. It's easier to defend. It feels easier to defend. Now, notably last night, Terry McLaurin was only on the left side 61%. That's a more normal rate for somebody like him. It's not up there in that 80 percentile range. So maybe, he is not going to do that this year for the rest of the year. I mean, he moved Terry McLaurin through the slot. But just in general, because this has been a long-standing thing that I kind of feel icky about with regards to Cliff Kingsbury offenses, do you think it's problematic to have a wide receiver kind of come out of one spot consistently all season long?
No, yeah, there's no question I do. I mean, defensive coordinators are incredibly smart in this league, and they're going to scheme and do certain things that will take out that receiver, knowing if there is consistency like you're suggesting. Yes, it is. I'd have to think, because I like Cliff personally. I think Cliff is a smart football man. And of course, I love Dan Quinn and how they're trying to do things. So I'm hoping that they'll understand, which they do understand, but why they wouldn't adjust that, to your point. I don't know if it's going to take a real kick in the teeth for them to realize that they need to do something with that.
And like I said, maybe they already realized that. Maybe, I overreacted to the first couple of games from Terry McLaurin. Maybe because the numbers were consistent with what we've seen from Cliff consistently, but it wasn't last night. So that's notable. And they had a lot of success. But Jaden Daniels having the game that he had against, again, an admittedly terrible defense. The Bengals defense was awful, that's another conversation. Like, what? Lou Anarumo? What? Huh?
Yeah.
But Jaden Daniels, at the very least, I think in Washington, they've got to be feeling pretty good about the guy that they drafted because we knew that he could do certain things, but we saw the deep ball open up last night.
Well, Adam Peters right now, he's taking a deep breath. Obviously, any of these rookie quarterbacks and rookie GMs who first pick ever is a quarterback that they're going to roll with. At least they feel very comfortable with it right now. What he seems to be, not only does he have the ability to move the ball around, he can run his ass all over the place, and he's been making smart decisions, right? We know how important that is. We know how important it was, the last, when we're talking about, Houston and their quarterback. We also know what it isn't in some of these other places where they're tossing balls up in Indianapolis or, in Chicago or wherever some of these other newer quarterbacks are. I'm just coming back to the team building side. Like, that is a great feeling knowing that, okay, you're not coming out of the gates where everyone's just questioning, because we do that a lot, right? Early on. It's way early. It's not even a quarter of the way through the season. And people are making judgment on some of these quarterbacks, which I get. That's natural. That's today's world, right? So
Yeah.
I love the fact that, Adam Peters right now and Dan Quinn, how they decided to kick this off. And Adam is looking back to his days, which he was very involved in the pick in San Francisco that didn't work out so well, right? Because everyone's involved. I'm not putting it on Adam Peters, believe me. But what I'm saying is you go there and you're involved in that, whether you're involved in hammering the table, which he might have been or not, you were a part of that. So for him to go and kick off his own organization with Dan Quinn, you're going to learn from those lessons. So obviously did a lot of great work on Jaden Daniels. It's early, but I think that's a good feather in Adam Peters' cap right now that, he and Dan brought a guy like this in that is not Trey Lance-esque at this point. Respectfully to Trey Lance as an athlete.
I would. There's a lot of reason for hope there in Washington, probably for the first time in an awfully long time. You mentioned judging quarterbacks early, and I have to admit that I'm kind of doing that with regards to Anthony Richardson, and not in terms of long term.
Mhm.
In terms of long term, there is no possible way that I would give up on these traits at this point in time. But I wonder if maybe we might need to start thinking about the possibility that they pivot to Joe Flacco in the short term. For part of the reason that we saw Carolina do that with Bryce Young. Bryce Young just was all out of sorts and could not execute things in a way that was acceptable even for the other pieces around him to reach their potential. And that's why we heard words like mutiny and locker room and stuff like that with regards to him.
Mhm.
Now, I'm not saying that that's the case with Anthony Richardson, but it's clear that like a Michael Pittman is not having the type of year that Michael Pittman would like to have. And that is largely because the quarterback play is what it is. This is a guy who, again, has the rocket arm. Love it. You want the arm, you want the legs. But in terms of his ability to just quarterback competently, this is somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience. Thomas is completing just 49% of his passes. His completion percentage over expectation is -11. That's last in the league. Obviously, the completion percentage is too. He is struggling. And I worry about him struggling to this degree for too long. Like I want them to protect him. And I also want them to protect the other assets in the offense. And I'm wondering if you think that there's any chance. I know the situations are different. Is there any chance that we see them kind of start to look at this situation the same way that Carolina did?
To me, there's a difference here. And I know Chris Ballard is a through and through football man who knows talent. He's a, very, very sound evaluator and knew what they were getting in the sense of an athlete that they were going to have to grow with. He needed experience. We know all of that storyline. We talked about it ad nauseum before he was even drafted, right? He gets injured last year, so it's not like he's had a full year to work through everything. He got injured, and Stavsky, you can bring it up exactly what game it was last year. I'm trying to think of where it was in the scope
It
of
was early. It was
but
early.
it was early. So he comes back. He's still in the early stages. I don't know, has he played 7 or 8 games yet? Considered this season last year when he got injured? I don't believe so. Maybe I'm wrong in that. The reality is, so I don't think in any way a guy like, and I'm speaking for someone like Chris Ballard, would say, let's make this move and let's yank this guy, because what we really need to see as an organization, more and more growth, more maturity. And I'm talking about maturity, not just on the field and decision making. Those were some, I mean, two of the interceptions that we watched, those were not looking good. There was another one that luckily he didn't have down the middle of the field. That could have been a 3, of course. And I look at all that, and they have to be happy they won. Then they put him on the podium, which I know they have to. And he just, there's some growing to do there. Even how he was on there, if you didn't probably get a chance to watch him with the media, but I was watching him just to get a sense. I love doing that with some of the young quarterbacks. How are they dealing with some of the animosity? I mean, that's 156 yards isn't what we're looking for. 2 interceptions and the percentages. How do you go in there? How do you face the media? How are you answering the questions? How are you responding? And I just sensed a little bit of immaturity there, which will come along. He's still a young guy, but you want an upgraded maturity level for a quarterback that's going to be carrying your team, and that's something that hopefully will come around, and they'll continue to press that. They have to get him ready in all levels, right? Of course, on the field, but off the field as well, because there's going to be a lot of darts coming his way if he continues to be sub 50%.
There's just it. I mean, it seems like basic things. I mean, it's not basic. I understand once everything. He's still very young in his quarterbacking career, right? But there are some like technical things that feel like his footwork gets sped up pretty consistently. And there's a massive difference in terms of execution when he actually just, pays attention to his footwork versus he's kind of all over the place. So I don't know. I feel like that it looks like something that needs a lot of work. And I just am really concerned again. And I'm saying this maybe differently than Bryce Young, because I do have such optimism for Anthony Richardson long term. I am just I'm worried about his them losing him short term. One of the stats actually, and this is actually a fair, because Josh Allen was all over the map, right? Early on. Richardson's intended air yards through 3 games is 12.6 per attempt. That's very high. The closest recent was Josh Allen in 2018, and that was 11. And I think that you can probably make a pretty good comp about the way that Josh Allen started and the way that Richardson is starting. But I just, and so in Allen's case, obviously it was a work through it, and then it clicked and it was amazing. And now you get the benefit of all of the traits that they bet on. I'm a little bit worried about, them potentially like losing him in the muck of this situation. And I want to protect that.
Well, the muck, as you call it, of this situation, it's legitimate, right? It's a good word. And I watch it, I'm thinking, what's admirable is he's one of those dudes that's like, I'm going to make this damn play, and he'll tuck it and go.
Yeah.
He was even in the middle of, what they used to call in Canadian Football League, tandem buck. No one uses it here. Look it up one day. Basically the tush push. It's a more layman's term.
Tandem buck.
He was literally in the middle of all that, right? Right in the middle of it, trying to get his, get that touchdown. He'll tuck the ball and go, like the good running backs are doing right now, the athletic running backs. But we know that that's something he has to scale back in order to grow in this position. But when that comes along and you get frustrated and you're throwing sub 50 and, balls are being intercepted, you're like, I just have to do whatever I have to do to get the win. And I think that was his point. But you can only have so much of that, right? At least as an organization, you want to build. I know I'm beating it to death, but he'll tuck it and go. We don't need that this year, though. He got injured last year by basically doing that. Yep. We don't need him to slam his head against the turf. We need him to use his head to get down the turf and make the big plays, right? So.
Well, I drew the connection there between a Flacco coming in and maybe, the offense operating a little bit more consistently to what happened with Andy Dalton last week in the Panthers. What a difference that made.
What a difference. I was so excited to watch that game because, I have a fondness for Carolina and some of the people there, because I think they have smart people in place, right? Dan Morgan's in place. We talk about Brant Tillis, who came over, who was right there beside, Dan, they're working together, and he brings a really intelligent element to it, right? A strong and passionate about it because he brings a strong, data approach to it, which we know how important that is to SumerSports. So I laud the people out there that take their really good football knowledge, Dan Morgan, and they pair it with someone and something like open-minded, like let's dig into some of the advanced elements here, which I think is good. So I step back and I'm watching that game, and I'm watching Dalton, back to my point, throwing darts, man. I was so excited. I was like, this guy's got a presence in here. He's throwing balls. He's not only completing balls on wide open people. I mean, he is zipping them in again with just, there was something about it that I thought was great. It was great to show, Chubba Hubbard was running his ass off too.
Yep.
He was putting himself on the line, right? So they were just, I felt like his presence as a quarterback, along with a running back that was toting the rock like you want to see it. What do you have? Did he have almost 130 or 20 yards? But it was fun to watch that again, right? It was 114 yards, but that was good. So it was fun to watch the quarterback.
And Deontay with 122.
Yeah. Deontay for sure.
Adam Thielen going to IR, so they won't have him moving forward. I think that is maybe a hit for the offense. We'll see what Xavier Leggett can do. Maybe he gets a few more targets there.
Well, we got to justify that first round pick, right?
Well, it'll be easier to do that with Andy Dalton, right? Like you'll be able to get a better read on what you did there with Leggett at the very least. Yep. I mean, what weird sentences we're finding ourselves saying this year. Like, well, at least Andy Dalton will help them get a read on their wide receiver asset. What is happening here? One more
thing though, like when you think about that team right now, and we're going to bury this for a while, how long does it take for us to come back and start talking about what has been out there, the idea of trading? And all of a sudden it was all over the place. Florio, everyone was covering it, right? I saw it, is that really going to happen? Are there going to be more and more interests in a guy like, Bryce Young if someone loses their quarterback, or, it's a long season. And so does that ever resurface? But I think we just quietly keep our eye on it. If he's not being traded, which I can't imagine he would be, but it could happen. How are they getting him ready? What is he doing during this time to step in when there is a good chance Andy Dalton's, quick rise like this, meteoric rise, is going to settle? And when do they make a decision to potentially bring back Bryce Young? Okay, you're ready. It's been 4 games. It's been 6 games. You ready? Let's go. I don't know.
I think we both agree that would probably have a lot more to do with whether or not they thought Bryce Young was ready than Andy Dalton not being good. Like they'll let Andy Dalton struggle before they put Bryce Young back out there to struggle again. Correct?
I'm sure they will. And yet it'll be a really interesting case study to watch for any of these other teams if they're ever going to look to do this. I don't even want to suggest to do it, because I think there's other quarterbacks. You're talking about Chicago and other people. That's a quick, like that's early. Those are early moves, right? Last year when you're talking about the Colts, now it's still maybe premature. But I think when I know as a former GM, you look around, and when there's history of some of these moves and it's a little more common, then quite honestly, your owner accepts it a little bit more. Maybe your fan base accepts it a little bit more because they've seen some level of success in the next quarterback that comes in. I just think it's fascinating. In my mind, I would never, ever have thought when Matt Ryan was struggling, get his ass out of there and, put Chris Redman in. I love you, Chris, but I would never have been thinking about that. That wasn't why we drafted Matt Ryan. Let's grow him.
Last question for you with regard to Bryce Young and the potential for the scenario that you just laid out even happening. So I'm curious about how they continue to develop him, because they're going to need to use the majority of their reps at practice to get Andy Dalton ready for the game so that they can win the game and get the team ready for that. So how do you go about still developing Bryce Young? What does that look like in terms of reps? What does that look like in terms of work, maybe aside from the team? And are there any clues in that and what they do moving forward with regards to how much attention they pay him as to whether or not they intend to trade him or they intend to salvage him for themselves?
That's a very good question. I think it's contingent on the coaching staffs and their beliefs and their philosophies, right? I think, on one side, a guy like, they're two different phenotypes, right? They're just different football players. So, when you're out there and you're all of a sudden, moving in, someone like Bryce Young, who's 5'10", and Andy Dalton's what, 3 or 4? How, 6'3" or 4? I can't even remember.
Okay.
Maybe he's not that tall. Maybe
A
he's only,
normal-sized quarterback?
but he is a legitimate sized quarterback. Yes, I get it. And so, what do you do? What do you do during the week? How much, to your point, how much time do you give your number one overall pick, which is massively important? That's not just our quarterback didn't work out, and we're going to just give up as many reps as we can to our starter. This is another big decision to make organizationally. How much time do we set aside for this guy, Bryce Young? And I don't have the answer to that. I don't know what I would do because I wasn't put in that spot.
Yeah.
But you can imagine you need to get your quarterback ready as much as possible. And this guy that we're talking about, who is our number one, draft pick, if we stop using him in practice and he doesn't really get the time, then you're down on a lot of levels, right? Because if it is time for him to come back 6 or 8 games in, he's not necessarily ready. It's an uphill battle trying to navigate that. I can only imagine.
Well, they're not the only team navigating uphill battles. It's been a weird year in the NFL scoring down. Maybe we can get into some of the reasons surrounding that on Thursday as we turn the page to look ahead to week 4. Thomas Dimitroff, always fun chatting with you. Thank you so much for joining us here on the SumerSports Show. And make sure, if you are not already a subscriber, that you go ahead and hit that follow or subscribe button, depending on where you are watching. And if you want to leave a review, we'd love to hear your feedback on the show. And we'd love for you to join us again on Thursday.